Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Nadia. Today, joining us today is Linda Fabiani, former MSP who served as a Minister and Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament. She was also a key member of the Smith Commission, which shaped Scotland's post-referendum devolution settlement. Linda, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And we also have Campbell Gemmell, previous Chief Exec, Gemmell, sorry about that, Chief Exec of SEPA and consultant for OECD and Honorary Professor of Glasgow University. Welcome, Campbell.
Hi there, good afternoon. I've been called worse.
Okay, sorry about that. So we'll get on to the news and first thing is Ukraine update. On Saturday, a few hours after Russian strikes across Ukraine claimed more lives, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that Ukraine has proposed a new round of peace talks with Russia next week. Security Council Secretary Umerov reported that he had proposed the next meeting with Russian side for next week. Zelensky said in his evening address, "The momentum of negotiations must be stepped up." At talks last month, Russia outlined demands including Ukraine ceding more territory and rejecting all forms of Western military support. Kiev dismissed them as unacceptable and at the time questioned the point of further negotiations if Moscow was not willing to make concessions. Two rounds of talks in Istanbul between Moscow and Kiev have failed to result in any progress towards a ceasefire, instead yielding large-scale exchanges of prisoners and the bodies of soldiers. Russia launched a massive attack on Ukraine overnight into Saturday with hundreds of drones, killing at least one person. Zelensky said Russia fired more than 300 drones along with more than 30 cruise missiles into 10 regions. Russia now often batters Ukraine with more drones in a single night than it did during some entire months in 2024. An analyst says the barrages are likely to escalate. 2 people died after a Russian missile hit Ukraine's central Dnipropetrovsk region, an important industrial hub into which Russia's forces have recently advanced. Russia launched its biggest ever attack on the eastern Ukrainian city of Pavlohrad early on Saturday as part of large wave of strikes across the country. According to regional governor Zregov Lesky, the strike destroyed an outpatient clinic, a school, and a cultural institution. One person died in Black Sea port city of Odessa, which was hit with more than 20 drones and a missile, according to Odessa Mayor Hennady Trekhnov. 5 people were rescued from a fire in a residential high-rise building. 6 other people were wounded in the attack in Odessa, including a child, and a critical infrastructure was damaged in Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region. Russia's defense ministry said it shot down 71 Ukrainian drones overnight into Saturday. The mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, said 13 drones were shot down as they approached the Russian capital. Russia had to suspend trains for about 4 hours, causing extensive delays in the southern Rostov region when it came under a Ukrainian drone attack that wounded one railway worker. On Saturday, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha accused Russia of deporting Ukrainian citizens into Georgia and leaving them stranded without proper identification. Sybiha said Moscow has escalated the practice of expelling Ukrainians, many of whom are former prisoners, across its southern border with Georgia, instead of returning them directly to Ukraine. Dozens of people, many of whom lack proper documentation, have been stuck in the transit zone that amounted to Russia weaponizing the deportation of Ukrainian citizens. He added, there has been no immediate response from Moscow. We've got just a couple of minutes to discuss this. Shall we start with understanding of where this really stand in Ukraine right now? Linda?
I find it more and more difficult, Nadia, to be saying anything about the situation with Russia and Ukraine because it just seems that it goes on forever and poor Ukraine unfairly is getting hammered by the aggressor, because Russia is the aggressor. What I do wonder is I wonder about President Zelensky calling for further peace talks next week. And I wonder if there's something there that says Ukraine are getting to the point of thinking maybe we will have to concede some things. That's worrying, because I think whatever Ukraine would concede now doesn't mean that Russia would stop. They might have a pause, they might have a break, but I don't think it will stop. I also get the feeling that the international community is coming to the point where they want Ukraine to make concessions. It would seem to them the easiest answer, a bit of appeasement to Putin. But as I say, I'm not convinced that appeasing Putin will have any long-term effect whatsoever.
Thank you, Linda. Campbell?
Yeah, I find it hard to disagree with what Linda's just said. I think we're all weary to varying degrees of how long this has gone on. But I do think the extraordinary sort of brinkmanship between the White House, if I would use that term, because I'm not sure that Trump is wholly leading the various developments here, although there's widespread opinion now that he is, to varying degrees, a Russian asset. But he obviously got quite cross and quite grumpy about it, and so did some of his senior staff, that Putin made promises which he then resiled upon. I have a feeling that that will continue. Like Linda, I think even if Ukraine decided to accede to some of the pressures that either Russia or the West were applying to him and to them, it wouldn't stop things. It wouldn't stop the process of exploitation and capturing of land and assets from continuing. So, yeah, I think I said this and a couple of previous times on the show. I do not know how this ends, and I'm not sure that anybody does know how this ends, because Putin's campaign for Greater Russia it carries on, and until Putin goes, I don't see a significant likely change in that strategy, unless in some other weird and wonderful way it's made worth his while. And probably the only people that could deal him things that he really wants, they are either Trump or President Xi in China. So I don't think the EU, the UK, even NATO can achieve very much. I feel incredibly sorry for the Ukrainian people, and particularly for a president who has just kept on trying. But he must be running out of energy. It's just awful how long this has gone on.
Thank you both. It's a topic like we can talk for longer hours, but we have to move on to the next one. At least 58,795 Palestinians have been killed and 140,485 wounded in Gaza since 7th October 2023. Israel continues shooting people queuing for food. In the 90s, Bosnia shelling a market was called a war crime. So why not call out Israel? Who not call out Israel its action? Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, it segues horribly well with the previous story. It feels like this just goes on and on. The sort of double standard being applied by Western governments, I can't get it. It beggars belief that we have people protesting against the Israeli government and IDF behavior and calling for peace, being identified as terrorists. And we have terrorists, i.e. the IDF and the crazy right-wing government in Israel, being supported and encouraged and given weapons and given financial support. And our government and others seem to be happy also to receive financial support from related sources. So yeah, it is unbelievable. If this is not a genocide, I have absolutely no idea what is. Shooting unarmed, non-combatant children queuing for food and water is no, it's evil, it's heinous, it is also a war crime, and yet it seems Sir Keir and others are quite happy to see it carrying on. And if they're not happy, they're certainly not making it very clear that they're not happy. I just don't get it. If you quote David Lammy to David Lammy, things he said before coming into office and what he says as Foreign Secretary, again, it beggars belief. I don't understand. This is a genocide.
Thank you so much, Campbell. And Linda?
Yeah, it certainly is a genocide. And the other things that are going on with it, well, we've got all this stuff happening in Gaza. It's covering up what's happening in the West Bank, more people killed in the West Bank. I look at last week's incursion by Netanyahu and Israel into Syria. That's surely about the Golan Heights. So they're massacring people and having land grabs, the expansion of the Israeli state. I am numb with shock at how Palestinians are being perceived. It's almost like they're non-people. It's horrible. Just their lives aren't worth anything, certainly as far as the Israeli government's concerned, but it's beginning to feel that way with other governments as well, who still support Israel and support Netanyahu. I read a report, Nadia and Campbell, just this morning that I have to admit I've not been able to verify, but it absolutely horrified me. It said that the Israeli government were relocating donkeys from Gaza to sanctuaries in Europe because the donkeys were being traumatized. So if we're at the stage where donkeys are more important than people, it really sums up the Israeli government's views about the people of Gaza. I mean, I was heartened slightly at the beginning of this week when I saw the reports of young people in Israel tearing up the draft cards, setting fire to the draft cards, and campaigning against the genocide in Gaza. And if I remember rightly, we're actually referring to it as genocide as well. So, meanwhile, people are still being killed. As far as the UK government's concerned, you know, what Campbell was talking about the prescription of Palestine action, I can't quite get my head around the idea that we've got a Labour government in the UK that not only expels people like Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, but is arresting people, peaceful protesters from all walks of life, because they are peacefully protesting against a genocide. And this is a Labour government. It really does not bode well for the future of the UK. And you know, for a long, I've wanted independence for absolutely most of my life. But when I look at what's happening here, I want Scotland to be an independent nation that stands for peace and stands for people's right to peaceful protest, no matter how uncomfortable that is for the government of the day. And yeah, I'm just appalled by everything that's going on. And the fact that yet again we have a UK government looking towards the US and seem to be following on their coattails.
You both are right. It's very difficult to figure out, like, you know, why the Western countries are not standing up for their, you know, people, those who are suffering in Palestine.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the next topic, if that's okay. As Donald Trump threatens to take the Wall Street Journal to court over allegations about the nature of communications between Trump and convicted child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, with Trump taking on his former billionaire supporter Rupert Murdoch. Will all the Epstein papers be unsealed, and what might they reveal? Linda?
Do you know, if it wasn't real, it would almost be like a comedy show, you know? First of all, we had when Trump first came in, you know, we had him and Musk head to head, two of the most powerful men in the world who were the best of pals, and everybody said, this won't last because there's two massive egos. And it hasn't lasted, as we have seen. We've yet to see the whole fallout of that particular relationship. And I was stunned when I saw during the week that Trump was talking about suing Murdoch. Again, two very, very powerful men. Maybe Rupert Murdoch not so much now, because obviously he's very elderly. But, the huge corporation that's behind him, and Trump has decided to take it on. So there's a bit of a watch the space here, as there is about the Trump supporters backlash. Could it really be that this would be something that would absolutely affect Trump and make him weaker? Because it would seem that there are those in his own support who are not at all happy that he has reneged on his promise to open the list, which, if I remember rightly, the Attorney General, if that's a proper term, can't remember, said was sitting on her desk and all of a sudden doesn't exist. Bad things going on in the US. This is just one of many of them. And I will reiterate that it really concerns me that we have a UK government that still appears to be looking across the Atlantic for the way forward.
Thank you so much. Campbell?
Yeah, it's pretty tragic that this almost qualifies as light relief given the previous two stories. But I mean, I think it is incredibly serious because it is about corruption and ultimate corruption connected to ultimate power. Trump is creating a world in which all of the forces of control and certainly of opposition, but of control of the presidency have been deconstructed, and he has a fully aligned, apart from 3 members, Supreme Court, and he is basically continuing to make it up as he goes along, but to destroy anyone and anything that undermines him, disagrees with them, etc. And he also is still looking for deals and for opportunities to make money for himself and his family and his core supporters. I think Linda's point is very important about the splits or the tensions between the radical right, the Christian right, the bulk of the MAGA supporters, the slightly wacky, opportunistic, I said slightly, that's probably not, that's an understatement of the day, but the crazy people that are involved in the tech sector who have found ways, particularly during the Doge period, of taking advantage of the Trump era. There is a house of cards around Trump that is based, I think, on the Epstein story. He's managed to delay or foul up various court cases against him, but there is this sort of burning long fuse related to the whole Epstein period and the child sex trafficking, the various parties, the drugs, the documents, the fraud, etc., that's associated with the Mar-a-Lago period, and also with Epstein's neighborhood property. He had a property in New York and properties elsewhere. Both of them had the sort of New York to Florida shuttle with various things going on in between. So I think Pam Bondi definitely was quoted as having the report and the documents on her desk. He's now decided, as another of his many squirrels that he throws out there just to distract us all, that the grand jury testimonies and reports will be released. Tiny part of the overall story. There's a great deal of other documentation, including the list. There's also Ghislaine Maxwell, and she's a sort of Banco's ghost lurking. If she does get the chance to talk, if she's not taken out by the part of the Republican system and the Trump defense system, it'll be very interesting to see what she can reveal. But I think this is again, as Linda said, I think this is quite a long game battle, especially American courts. Lord knows how that progresses. But if it does end up at the Supreme Court, it will be an ultimate test, I suspect, of the whole process. But Trump has also, or Trump's people, have gone for individual journalists, not just for the paper. And people who know a lot more about this than me have made it quite clear that they think that that was a bad call on Trump's part, and that in particular could lead to a lot of material being required for court cases. And some of these journalists will be more happy to go down in flames than Murdoch would be. So it's a can of worms has been opened, and I think there are plenty of worms to come out.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic. This week, Labour suspended 4 party members for voting against the party's disability benefit cuts. In any political party, discipline is important. But why were just these four suspended and when over 47 broke their party whip? So, from Scotland, if we see Brian Leishman was suspended, is it because he spoke for Scotland? He's the only Scottish MP who spoke for Scotland, and there were other Scottish MPs those who have voted against the whip. Campbell?
I don't know enough about what has actually gone on behind the scenes. I think Brian Leishman could be commended for actually standing up for his constituents and his constituency, and that is, on the face of it, a perfectly honourable thing to do. He has, on other things, more clearly toed the government line, but there has been quite a lot of anger and tension and so forth within the Scottish bit of the party. It's interesting that Anas Sarwar has been completely silent about all of this. He's taken the King's shilling or Sir Keir's shilling, whatever. But I think there are some interesting and very uncomfortable members of the party in Scotland who are wondering what on earth is going on. But as Linda also said earlier on about Diane Abbott and others, you know, a party with a huge majority, a leader with a huge majority, you would have thought could sort of thole quite a lot of this and just kind of ride through. But there's a pettiness, there's a kind of weird doctrinaire dimension to the leadership behaviour, and a certain light-haired gentleman who is advising the Prime Minister, Morgan McSweeney, is being identified as having a bit like one of the Deputy Chiefs of Staff in the White House, a kind of vitriolic nasty streak where people who oppose or cause embarrassment have to be taken out. They can't be ignored or sidelined. They have to be taken out. So I kind of think that's roughly what's going on. But I mean, this is not a Labour government. This is like way further right than even Blair, and they're behaving just in the craziest of ways. So yeah, I think loyalty to Sir Keir or loyalty to McSweeney probably is important. But I'm not quite sure loyalty to Labour principles are relevant, and I think the Red Clydesiders would have quite a challenge working out any connection between this Labour government and anybody with vaguely socialist ideals and principles, or any, frankly, principles at all. Grangemouth has not been saved. An English refinery has been supported in ways that were apparently not possible in Scotland. Now, if that's not to forgive the vernacular, but if that's not to screw Scotland and benefit English voters and English capital owners, I'm not quite sure what is. But this is the really unpleasant Labour Party, Labour government that we seem to be subject to.
Yeah. Linda, as someone who has served as an elected representative in Scottish Parliament, can you tell us, is it wrong for members to question their party when it strays from its manifesto commitments, and when a party fails to deliver on promises it made to the electorate? Should parliamentarians simply stay silent?
Now there's a question, and it's one I battled with over many, many years. So I do have very mixed feelings about the fundamentals of this issue, let's say. I do think that if you are elected on a party ticket, that there is a responsibility on you to be corporate with your party. That's a general statement I'm making. You should be able to internally voice dissent and have the discussion, like in any other team, in any other workplace. You have a discussion. You perhaps don't always agree with everything, but you generally go along with the majority view. In this particular case, what Campbell said and what you said in introducing this, Nadia, is important, however, because these people were elected on a manifesto that was quite clearly a bunch of lies. The current so-called Labour government have broken manifesto commitments, have broken promises that they made that they allowed all their candidates to make, for example, standing with WASPy women support posters. And they have broken all of these. So the question becomes a bit different. It is, yes, I was elected on a party ticket, but this is not the platform upon which I was elected. I would then go on to, I mean, if I tell you in my own case, I think I broke the whip 3 times. Twice in my whole career. Twice was through absolute stupidity because I pressed the wrong button right up front, honest about that. I think once I pressed the wrong button and once I forgot to press the button at all because I was too busy gossiping with Christina McKelvey, and the two of us got carpeted because we'd forgotten to vote. But I did break the whip once on an issue that I felt was very important and that my party was completely wrong with. I'll tell you what it was, because you may be thinking, what was it? It was the first time that a smacking ban came up in Parliament, very, very early doors, and for some reason our party decided to oppose it, and I couldn't oppose it. Therefore, I broke the whip and got appropriately sanctioned. But that brings me on to the question of red lines. No matter how you're elected, I believe that everyone should have their own red lines. That was a red line for me that I could not cross. I feel myself very, very fortunate that in my career of 20 odd years in Parliament, that was the only red line I ever had to face. There were things that maybe I wasn't very happy about, but I took the majority decision, but they weren't red lines, so I supported it. So, for me, the welfare and benefit cuts would have been a red line. Maybe it's that for the ones who voted against it. So they have to seriously think about their future within that party. As far as the 4 that got suspended are concerned, I suspect it's because they were mouthier than the others and did a lot of media and stuff. 2 things that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the fact that we don't have any other Scottish Labour elected members coming out and support Leishman. Particularly the Scottish leader, Anna Sarwar. What are they all looking to the elections next year and worried about their own positions, deselections, etc.? Red lines, that's got to come in. I'll tell you the other thing that really bothers me. All these so-called socialist Labour members of the House of Lords, who, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, denied their principles by going to the House of Lords in the first place, but continue to deny their principles in terms of keeping very, very quiet about what the current Labour government is doing, with a couple of honourable exceptions. But there you go. So that's where I am. I understand why people were suspended. I get that. But I also don't understand why they're still in the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Suspend yourself if it's a red line.
Yeah. The next topic is about infrastructure in UK. It can be very easy to be impressed by overseas transport and infrastructure, with significant investments being made in road tunnels through mountains, motorway, viaducts, across valleys, and management system, which seems designed to keep traffic moving. But why has it taken so long to improve trunk roads like the A9, A75, A96, and the rest be thankful? Where was the vision in 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s? Before we start the discussion, Linda, our program producer, has got a video which she just returned from Bosnia, and she has brought back some powerful footage. Let's take a look at that now before we move on to the discussions, if that's okay. Campbell?
Yeah, nice to see. There are several issues there about why this isn't the case. I started working in Norway and Switzerland in the 80s, and both nations, not only are they independent, one of them has a lot of money from banking and other activities, and the other one has a lot of money from sensible use of the oil and gas revenues that have gone through their hands. We are not an independent nation, and therefore it hasn't happened. If you want to make it happen, you have to choose to make it happen, to deliver first-class infrastructure. I think there are a whole series of issues that then come in under that. I sat for a number of years on the structural funds committees in Scotland, for West and East of Scotland. The use of European funding during the period that we were members was often very effective for certain kinds of infrastructure. Were they eligible? So there are roads, there are car parks, there are various facilities, including ferry terminals and the like, across Scotland that were effectively built using joint funding packages that were put together using European funding. And even in the last 6-year European funding period, from 2014 to 2020, something like 940 million euros was spent in Scotland of European structural funding money on industrial support, infrastructure support, social support of various kinds. We were promised through Levelling Up Fund and various other wheezes of the Conservative administration in particular that they would effectively match what had come from the structural funds. That was nonsense. It hasn't happened. But you have to choose to make this a priority. And we have we've got ourselves in a cleft stick because, and I admit I'm part of the Green movement in a way, but the Green movement has made this even harder because roads are bad. Now, I think good roads are good, and I also think that good railways are good, and both railways and roads require, in a geography like Scotland, tunnels and bridges and viaducts, etc. If you go to Norway, if you go even to the Faroes, with whatever it is, 46,000 population, they connect these incredibly mountainous islands that rise out of the sea and are adjacent to each other with deep trenches of water in between. They connect them with tunnels and bridges and ferries, and it works really well. It costs a lot of money. You have to pay for these things. I'd far rather we had paid for that rather than paying for very expensive nuclear weapons or aircraft or other things that we have chosen, the UK, have chosen to spend our money on. The A9 dualling, for example, has been discussed endlessly for decades. But there has always been hostility to it, opposition, particularly from the Green movement, but also from local landowners and others who didn't think they were going to be paid enough for it to happen often, but also who just didn't want to see it happen, despite road traffic accidents and various other issues. The rest can be thankful. You mentioned in the intro. Absolutely fundamental. If you look at Dala in the west of Norway, the very similar sort of issues of regular landslides, an overgrazed hillside, oversteepened, etc. You could have planted trees on it a long time ago, but of course we don't do that because sheep and deer need to thrive because you get money from them, even though ordinary people don't get money from them. But if we wanted to, there could have been protected large, long concrete structures that are very, very common in Scandinavia that would have kept the roads open a long time ago. So all across Europe, all across actually, particularly the west of the US, but even in the northeast of the US, money has been spent on high quality infrastructure. We have not chosen to do so, with one or two notable and honourable exceptions, Skybridge, etc. And the Scottish Government's approach to not having them toll raised is an issue that I think should be celebrated. But just one final point, your last clip there, Linda, was very interesting because we didn't see many other cars on the road. That highlights the fact that you have to have an economic model to make these work, not just to build them, but to maintain them. So to maintain them. So do you have tolls? Do you have it paid through taxation? Do you have it paid through other usage forms? So there are lots of issues to be addressed, and it has become quite a complicated situation. But we should have started doing this when we started having money 40 to 50 years ago, but it offset UK debt and it bought weapons rather than actually being spent on high quality infrastructure.
Thank you, Campbell. And Linda?
Yeah, it's hard to add to what Campbell's been saying about the road structure in particular. And yes, it's been going back decades. I find it very frustrating that quite often the press and media in Scotland come out with, these reports about the lack of infrastructure. I mean, there was one today about how awful ScotRail is, even with nationalisation. And it always focuses on the SNP government and doesn't talk about the decades of lack of infrastructure right across the UK, apart from very specific parts. I mean, the SNP government has done what they can. One of the roads that I think of every time I go along, it's the A82 around Loch Lomond, where there were temporary traffic lights for more than 20 years, if you remember, under successive Labour and Tory governments, and the SNP put in a small bridge to make that flow better. Still not ideal. So, yes, there has been a lack of infrastructure across the UK for all of these years, except, as I say, in London and the South East. So I'll go on to trains a wee bit, I think, rather than roads.
Do you think
When
it
you
was
look
lack
at
of long-term vision do you think it was lack of long-term vision from the Westminster when they were initially constructing this?
No, I don't think it was lack of ambition. I think it was other priorities. It was about political choices. Campbell mentioned spending on weapons, for example. The way our oil revenues were frittered away to back up the financial service industry, and our own industries in Scotland were hammered for that reason as well. So no, I don't think it's lack of ambition. I think it's just not caring.
No, I was mentioning a lack
when you
of
look
vision because long-term vision for tourism, for example, Scotland thrives on tourism now, and like in the 1950s, they wouldn't have thought like many of the foreign tourists want to go to Inverness and Highlands and stuff like that. Do you think that
But no, they were below the radar as far as UK governments were concerned. They didn't give a toss about what was happening in Scotland. As long as they had their shooting and fishing and their estates that they came to, they were quite happy. Wasn't Scotland quite cute as a tourism destination? But when you look at what's been happening lately with infrastructure, the main thing you can talk about is the high-speed train, the HS2, that the Tories cancelled. They cancelled at the point where it was to come out of London in the southeast, proving yet again that that's the only area which matters. I was down in London recently and I was on the new Elizabeth line. It was fabulous. But as I say, they took it for their own region and then stopped it going into the north of England and up to Scotland, despite the promises. And when you look at mainland Europe, for rail as well as for road, that Campbell outlined very clearly, when you look at it for rail, I think the first high-speed rail line in mainland Europe was 1981. And, every developed nation in mainland Europe has high-speed rail now. The first high-speed rail that the UK did was for the Channel Tunnel in the 90s, I think that was. And it was only the mainland Europe part of it that became high speed. They didn't even have high speed for the bit that took you to the Channel Tunnel. So HS2 was their first proper big infrastructure project. And when you look at the shape of the UK, the way we are, south to north, it should have been fairly easy over the decades to have high-speed rail that would go from south to north. But no, you have south. You have the most populous part of the country. You have the part of the country where all the establishment tend to base themselves. And it got cancelled before it reached what it should have done. And Labour did not reinstate it. They should have reinstated it right away. What did they do? They kept it as it was. They kept the cancellation, all that waste of money, and now they're lifting planning restrictions about that area. So yet more money and more population will pile in to London and the southeast, while the north of England and Scotland is neglected yet again. And let's not pretend that the Scottish Government can work miracles with this. They can't, because the main financial levers are held at London, and they are held for the benefit of London and the South East. Andy Burnham has been going on about it for his region of which he's mayor, and I completely understand that, because, again, everywhere except that particular region down south has been dumped upon.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic, if that's okay. When the cross-party Scottish Affairs Committee report recognised that Scotland's finances are dictated by UK government spending decisions, irrespective of the impact on Scottish public services, yet rejected substantial changes, how and by whom should Scotland's finances be managed? Linda?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I was looking at this earlier, the report, and what they said was interesting. And this is a Westminster cross-party committee, and I'm reading here because I took a note of these points. They recognised, and it directly leads on from the discussion we just had about infrastructure, recognised that Scotland's finances remain largely dictated by the UK government's decisions, and that the impact on Scotland's public services doesn't actually matter. It also said that restrictions on borrowing restrict the Scottish Government to deal with shocks in the economy, etc. They talked about Rachel Reeves, as we all have been, about being Margaret Thatcher Mark II. And of course, there's inflation has started to rise again. So here we have Scotland, which out with London in the southeast, which has always managed to be the most successful part of the UK. We have Scotland, a very successful and rich region, for as the term they use, which is stymied at every turn by the UK government. Despite Anna Sarwar and all the rest going on about how we've got this wonderful devolution settlement. No, we haven't. And they're reneging on it all the time when you look at the legislation that's been put in place post-Brexit. So for me, it's just very, very obvious. Scotland should be an independent nation. Scotland should be like these independent small nations on mainland Europe who do very, very well with populations round about the same size or indeed lower. And the other thing that annoys me about all this is when you look at the population projections for countries in Europe, including the UK, although we're not in the European Union, we're still in Europe. The only part of the UK where the population is really rising to any significant degree is London in the southeast. When you look at the likes of Switzerland, Norway, and all these small independent European nations, they have rising population as a reflection of their success. Scotland, pretty static. And that's ridiculous for a nation that has the rich resources that Scotland has. So this Westminster Committee, for me, has just backed up the arguments that those of us who believe in independence have been having for many, many years.
Thank you. And you were the member of Smith Commission, and in relation to the Smith Commission, was it successful? Or can you please brief on that?
Well, you know, the Smith Commission, we fought hard for many, many things. We didn't get everything we wanted. I mean, it was a very obvious thing. You had myself and John Swinney for the SNP, and you had the Green Party on the one hand, and you had all the unionists ganging up against us on the other to deny any real change. You know, they talked a good game about welfare, etc. But we only got a very small proportion of powers. Having said that, there are certain things that without the Smith Commission we would not be able to do. For example, the child welfare payment, which has really helped to go some way towards alleviating child poverty in Scotland and family poverty. Without the Smith Commission, we would not have been able to implement that. So there was that. But what came after the Smith Commission was important as well, because it was after that that we started to look at financial settlements, taxation and everything. Broad agreements given. What would we then do? So we got borrowing powers, for example, but certainly not enough. Not enough to deal with the shocks of the failures of UK governments, of world recessions and all these things. And then there's COVID. All these things have affected where we're at. Scotland does not have the financial levers to enable us to deal with the world as it is today. And for me, it just would be really simple. Let's take our own affairs and make our own decisions. And I believe that we could be successful, the likes of Norway, the likes of Switzerland. When you look at even what Ireland is doing, that small neighbour of ours without our resources, you know, they're looking after their people better than we are. So it's possible.
Thank you, Linda. Campbell?
Yep. Totally agree with that. You only do have to look at Denmark, at Norway, and at Ireland, and even frankly at Malta and the Baltic states and others that have had a whole series of disadvantages coming into the model, and have chosen to invest very wisely in their futures, despite property market and various other crazy things, for example, in Ireland, that could easily have taken their eye off the ball. It's nice that a cross-party committee in Westminster is capable of stating what, to most of us in Scotland, I suspect, or at least half of us, is the bleeding obvious. It doesn't necessarily help us to get there, but this is where we've been for a while. I suppose just for what it's worth, pre 1990, I was probably a fairly typical, well-educated Labour supporter, and then I worked with Canon Kenyon Wright and a group of colleagues in the SDA where I was working at the time, and looked at the kind of economic trajectory that Scotland could follow as Region 13 or whatever of the UK, or as a separate nation. And the conversation began about what good could look like for Scotland, and also what the various accelerators and brakes were on that trajectory. I very quickly came to the conclusion that only as an independent nation could Scotland actually play a role that was its own role, rather than as a subservient component of a system that had a different set of values. And we do have a different set of values. I mean, maybe it's complex with various both right and left dimensions contained within it, but there is a pretty big group of people in Scotland now that recognise that Westminster serves Westminster's interests. And again, Linda touched on that earlier on. I can't believe that so many apparently committed socialists and Labour players were so keen to take on Ermin and have accepted it. That values that their fathers and mothers would not have recognised are perfectly comfortable for them now. They may have grown up in Lanarkshire or Fife or Glasgow or the Highlands, but somehow or other they're quite happy to take on this world. Now, that may sound petty and it may sound typical chip on shoulder, but to me it's also a reality. If we do not control our own destiny and our own resources, we can't make our own policies, we can't implement infrastructure programs, we can't do social programs to the extent that we could do were we an independent nation, because we keep having to perform within a, depending on the numbers you choose, and GERS of course has also been a big lie over many years. We've got 7% to 10% of the asset base and the resource of the country, but actually in Scotland we could have 100% of the asset base of the country. So these are choices, these are political choices. And I do wonder if people will be voting Labour quite so keenly at the next election. But my fear is, of course, that they might go totally Trump crazy and end up voting for reform just because they sound more compellingly change-based than Labour has proved itself to be. But that change would be terrifying and deeply, deeply destructive to Scotland, as some of the councils that reform is now running in England are quickly learning as these kind of far-right values express themselves into policies within the country. We are not a far-right country in Scotland. We are a centre-left country with one or two outliers. But we believe in community and society. We believe in investing in the people of the country and the resources of the country, not in the resources of the 1% or the 0.1% of the most affluent in the country. So we have such a long way to go. But yes, it's really nice that there is a parliamentary committee in Westminster that has more than just people with a nationalist perspective actually saying that maybe Scotland is constrained as it is, and maybe Scotland could be better off if it was able to run its own financial and other affairs. Again, I would go for a Simpsons response to that and say, oh.
Thank you. However, we have 4 more minutes. In this particular committee's recommendations and findings, if we go back to the infrastructure, topic which we had, and in terms of independence, we did not discuss this in detail. When we are independent, how we can do it and how better we can do it, and in relation to Smith Commission and all these things which you have discussed, if we can discuss that for 2 minutes, and then I can give 2 minutes to Campbell as well.
Okay.
Linda.
There's a couple of things come out from that discussion and from what I've been listening to Campbell saying. One of the great frustrations I have is, yes, it is good that this committee has come out with this stuff. But one of the great frustrations for me is that should be in the front of all of our national press. It should be leading in our national media stories. But it won't be. It might be mentioned somewhere inside a newspaper somewhere. It might be mentioned, or will it even be mentioned on the BBC? To me, that's why Scotland very much needs its own broadcasting companies, etc. And that's something. The right to broadcasting, the devolution of broadcasting, was something that we fought for in the Smith Commission that didn't come out. So that's a huge frustration. Again, we should have a Labour Party in Scotland that is diving on this as well and saying, look at this. Come on, Mr. Starmer, start looking seriously at Scotland, start being a Democrat. The frustration's huge. I did say there was something else that came to mind, Nadia, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was now. But that is an ongoing frustration that I have, is the lack of reporting of reality in the Scottish press and media.
Do you think Sarwar or whoever is in Scotland leading is not talking about this because they are afraid that in 2024, whatever they said to the electorate was wrong or sort of misleading the electorate?
Who owns, who controls the press and media? And if you look at that, you can see it's very much the Brit establishment. And when you look at the BBC, buried deep in its charter, I can't remember the exact words, but buried deep in the BBC charter, it more or less says that they have to preserve the integrity of the UK, so we're on a looter as far as the BBC is concerned, which many of us have realised for a long, long time. It's fear. It's fear. And that's why broadcasting and getting the truth out there is so very, very important. And that's why I support Broadcasting Scotland. That's why many people support Broadcasting Scotland.
Thank you.
It's because we have a view that is not rampant nationalist. It is a view that is honest and straightforward and tells the truth that very often is not being told elsewhere.
Thank you on that, Linda. Campbell? You've got 1 more minute here.
Sorry, I agree. So there's no need to say very much on that front. I think there is an absolute need for Broadcasting Scotland and a whole series of other independent-minded and independently funded broadcasters. And of course, funding is incredibly important because without the money, you haven't got a voice. But I can't imagine, the Herald or grumpy individuals in the Record or the Mirror or elsewhere actually addressing this issue. It'll be, nodded to or ignored. But that is absolutely the nub of the problem. We have somehow or other collectively failed to change the system. But of course, as we found out in 2014 and the build-up to the Indie Ref 1, we explored and exposed the bastions of vested interest across the financial sector, across the whisky industry, across landowning in Scotland, and across the existing governance models and the party system. So if everything continues to look south, and to try and work out what is it that they would like Sir Keir to hear, then we're doomed. We need independent voices. We need objectivity. We need rational discussion, and this should be just one useful tool in the conversation. That a parliamentary committee happens to agree that it would be a good idea for a different model to apply. We were promised, devolution and devolution plus. We now have devolution minus because we're trying to constrain, the UK government is trying to constrain and undermine the Scottish government and any democracy in Scotland. So we have a very long way to go, but the case is as strong now as it's ever been. And I look forward to hearing more from the Scottish government, because it feels like they kind of went off the boil on the notion of being an independent country and tried to show their managerial chops. Well, yeah, that's okay, but only with 7% of the economy, you can't actually make things work. So the campaign has to be for a better model, and it has to be for a better model pretty bloody soon. Forgive me.
Thank you, Campbell. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist without your support. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Linda and Campbell. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.